I'll make a start because, finish on time and start on time and finish early. Well, thank you for coming to us, our second paper for the season. This one's got a bit of a script as well, which is different to what we had a couple of weeks ago. I might give up on the script as well halfway through, so we'll just go where we go. So December sees the 50th anniversary of Tom Baker's first appearance as the character of the Doctor in the BBC television series Doctor Who. Baker, as most of you will know, would remain in the role for 7 years, still the longest serving actor in the role on television. There are ways of arguing for Sylvester McCoy or Paul McGann as the longest serving Doctor, but that requires counting other media, and as the civilians in the room, we'll leave it as Tom Baker is the longest serving Doctor. Baker's time in the role would see Doctor Who build on the healthy ratings enjoyed during John Pertwee's time in the role and see the programme return to the type of cultural prominence supported by high ratings, till the strange collapse in ratings for Baker's final season of the type not seen since the Dalek Mania boom of 1960 through 65, when they managed to kill it when they have a story about giant ants, and it's really rubbish. Baker's season, last season, is very sci-fi heavy, and the ratings are bad at the start. They pick up again. There's an argument that's been made that they pick up after Christmas, because in 1980-81, you had to do your Christmas shopping on a Saturday if you were at school because the shops closed on a Sunday, and then people were home to watch it on the telly on a Saturday night. However, the episode was Warrior's Gate, which is essentially impenetrable, so everyone went away again. However, Baker's long period in the role ultimately impacted negatively on both the programme and on the actor himself. Every Doctor after Baker, until the resting of Doctor Who in 1989, was compared to Baker and his 7 seasons. Peter Davison's time in the role saw the audience build from the curious lows of season 18, but I suspect in part the appeal was Davison himself, who was omnipresent on television in the 1980s. There's an inexplicable run of sitcoms, most of which are terrible, but of course he's also in All Creatures Great and Small, which is heritage TV. Baker's departure in 1984, changes within the BBC and long-running problems within the Doctor Who production office saw open season declared on the programme with the casting of Colin Baker. With a failed attempt made to cancel Doctor Who in 1985, the sacking of Colin Baker then after the 1986 season is a ratings disaster, and then the resting of the programme in 1989. Doctor Who was never officially axed. The BBC clearly want it made, but they just don't want to make it themselves. So they go through this long run of trying to farm it out to external production companies, which is part of the John Burt revolution in the 1980s, 1990s, and it gets stymied then when the American story is made with Paul McGann, which then doesn't lead to a series in America. Tom Baker's perceived continuing dominance of the role in the wider public mind, and certainly within the BBC, saw Baker return to the role in the strange Doctor Who EastEnders crossover Dimensions in Time. A truncated story shown as part of Children in Need in 1993, with the second part broadcast the following night during Noel's house party. It is, despite attempts by fandom to rehabilitate the story, as bad as it sounds. Samuel West, in an early role, it might be his first TV role actually, wears a leather fetish outfit while playing Kate O'Mara's sidekick. Bad waxwork heads of William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton, both dead by this stage, fly around the screen as part of the 3D extravaganza. You guys get the 3D glasses from the Radio Times that week, or from Looking or something like that. Louise Jameson, who's the best actress to appear as a companion in the original run of Doctor Who, in that she actually gets work after the role, wanders around Greenwich dressed as a, quote, Native American Indian, while the surviving Doctor Who actors try to hold together the madness of creaking Doctor Who monsters interacting with the creaking monster that was Pauline Fowler. All of this is meant to celebrate Doctor Who's 30th anniversary. If I recall correctly, there was a phone-in to decide which EastEnders cast member would help the Doctor, and it was Mandy or Big Ron. Obviously, it was Big Ron was then voted to appear to save this fiasco. Baker is kept above all of this nonsense. He introduces this folly in a separate studio-bound scene, dressed in his last costume as the Doctor. It's all fairly sad, as most sci-fi conventions are as well, when you see aging actors now forced into their costumes to sign for fans, like myself, although I don't go to conventions. The original plan for the 30th anniversary, a serious 90-minute story, was also designed around Baker returning to the role of the Doctor. There's something about a coffin and Sylvester McCoy's umbrella on top of the coffin to indicate none of this happened. It was a strange fever dream. And if we could just go back to Tom Baker and the high point and everything would be fine again. Something weird around that story that it never actually happens. And I think it was a holding pattern. And then all you get is dimensions in time. Just as the revived Doctor Who from 2009 onwards is forever in the shadow of David Tennant, and he is this generation's Tom Baker. The final decade of the original run of Doctor Who can't escape from Tom Baker. But Tom Baker can't escape from the role either. Unlike Tennant, still gets plenty of work and he seems to be in everything, Baker's television career clearly suffers from his continued association in the minds of producers and the public with the role of the Doctor. Certainly, Baker seemed to be aware of the dangers of typecasting and the continuing connection of him with the role. Hence, his decline is to take part in the 20th anniversary story of the Five Doctors, which results in the ingenious use of footage from the incomplete Douglas Adams story Sharda within the narrative of the Five Doctors. An ingenuity which is immediately undercut by the use of the terrible waxwork, is there any other kind, of Baker in the publicity photographs of the anniversary. If you haven't seen them, Google them now and you'll see just the full horror of this waxwork propped up in Doctor Who's car. Awfulness of the waxwork helps to distract from the recasting of the first Doctor. Richard Hundrell replaces the late William Hartnell, and the horror that is Patrick Troughton's wig, and it is a thing to behold. It's significant, I think, that Baker only really re-engaged with Doctor Who and fandom once he had a sustained run of roles on television. Baker gave a big interview to Doctor Who magazine, the Pravda of Doctor Who publications, in late 1991. It was his first for DWM since 1984. A year after that interview would see Baker providing the linking narration in a video release of the incomplete Sharda, which was done for children in need. No, Comic Relief, and Douglas Adams always claimed that he was tricked into signing the release because Adams had reused some of the material in Sharda for Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency and was kind of annoyed that this had turned up. It's weird. Anyway, Baker's playing himself, playing the Doctor, and then as the Doctor. It's a very odd thing. He also seems to wear the same suit in everything he does for those 2 years, including when he's playing a major role in Medics. So I don't know if there was just no money or he just really liked this double-breasted suit. He also appears in the video release of Tom Baker years, which saw him sat down watching clips of each of his stories in Doctor Who, and Baker not remembering a single thing about the story in question. It's hilarious and it's really good, but it's not what they thought they were getting. By that point, though, Baker had appeared in the BBC's 1990 adaptation of C.S. Lewis's The Silver Chair, which I'm going to refer to briefly in this paper, the 4-part series Selling Hitler, about the faked Hitler diaries, and he was about to appear in ITV's hospital drama Medics, which was a pretty good show, but which appeared just before the great vogue for hospital dramas, including The Imported ER and Jed Mercurio's Sublime Cardiac Arrest, which was on BBC 4 earlier in the year, which sees Helen Baxendale walk in and steal the programme from everyone else. Baker and Doctor Who haunt each other. Doctor Who is the creature to Baker's Victor Frankenstein. Baker is Doctor Who's Rebecca de Winter or Laura de Palma. Those literary and film references are a crude segue into the main topic of the talk, the repeated presence of Gothic texts across Baker's career. I'm not suggesting here that Baker was deliberately choosing texts because of their apparent Gothic elements, although in the case of his own fiction, the genre and content must be a choice on Baker's part, although there are some caveats in relation to the novel Scratchman, which I'll get into at the end of the paper. Rather, it's Baker himself who suggests to various producers and casting directors that he would be a good fit for Gothic or Gothic-style script. I'm using here Gothic both in the general, often inaccurate usage as a synonym for horror, but also more precisely in terms of Gothic literature, with particular reference to that first generation of Gothic texts, which include Matthew Lewis's The Monk and Radcliffe's The Italian, which have thematic features which connect them back to the 17th century Italianate revenge tragedies of John Webster and John Ford, and also forward to the unhinged spectacle that is Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, which I think is 1820. Maturin's Oscar Wilde's uncle or great uncle, isn't he? There's something like that. I've got it written down there. Failed, Paul. Before his casting as Doctor Who, Baker had already appeared in a number of horror films, the anthology film Vault of Horrors 1973 and The Mutations 1974, which is a weird kind of replay of The Island of Dr. Moreau. And he played strange and sinister characters in Nicholas and Alexander, in which Baker played Rasputin, and 1973's The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, where I think he browns up. Baker's career before Doctor Who is interesting. He'd appeared on stage with Laurence Olivier, played Jankin in Pasolini's adaptation of the Canterbury Tales, and he's in an Italian film from the same period. I've forgotten the title of it, and I've written it down here. But when he was cast in Doctor Who, he was working on a building site as all his acting work had dried up. Baker's casting came at a moment of transition in Doctor Who's production history. Having come close to cancellation in 1969, when Troughton left the role, the next 5 years with John Pertwee in the role of the Doctor has seen a growth in audience figures as a result of consistency in terms of the production office, in terms of scripts, and for the most part in terms of production values and performances. Some of this consistency was achieved at the expense of the freewheeling creativity, which had been a hallmark of early Doctor Who. Pertwee's time in the role saw the Doctor exiled to Earth, for cost reasons, if nothing else. They can't afford to make outer space. The time travel element implied by the TARDIS being a ship that can travel in time and space is largely absent from Pertwee's 5 years in the role. The space element is also curtailed for much of Pertwee's first 3 years in the role. Rather, Doctor Who becomes a far more action-orientated programme, much closer to some of the ITC serials of the period, and crucially, similar to James Bond and the Avengers. That's why Pertwee drives around in a vintage car, wears a cloak, and he's got a young assistant with him. There's also some Adam Adamant work in there as well, of course, but that hadn't landed with the public, so it's kind of disappeared from view. However, by 1974, with the death of Roger Delgado, the original and best master until Michel Gomez plays Missy in the revival, John Pertwee's request for more money being greeted with the typical BBC response of, "Thanks for all your work, we're sorry to see you go." Change was afoot, including, most importantly, the departure of Barry Letts and script editor Terence Dix, who brought real stability to the role. Letts will cast Baker. He'll come back to essentially see Baker's exit out the door as executive producer, and then he's the producer of the Sunday afternoon serial when Baker plays Sherlock Holmes in 1982. A clear change in direction, in type of story, and in tone occurs when Baker is cast. Baker's first story, Robot, by outgoing script editor Terence Dix, was atypical in terms of stories produced during Baker's 7 years in the role. Earthbound and featuring Unit, quasi-military organisation utilised during John Pertwee's period in the role, or Dad's Army in Space, as most of us know it, Robot is essentially a Pertwee-era story. Where it does point forward to the next 3 years of Doctor Who is in its deliberate reference to cinema, in this instance King Kong, but with the giant monkey replaced by a robot that develops a conscience and then grows to gigantic proportions. If you've not seen Robot, never before has a Barbie doll and an Action Man tank done such heavy lifting to suggest the giant nature of a robot. This is still on the iPlayer. You'll note that various episodes are disappearing from the iPlayer, including one I'm going to refer to here. Robot's still there, though. The new producer-script editor combo of Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes radically changed the programme. The jump between the earthbound tea time adventures of Robot and the proto-alien space horror of The Ark in Space is stark. The Hinchcliffe and Holmes years tend to be described by fandom as Gothic. By that, fandom tended to mean horror, as it's clearly a period of the programme which tends towards the horrific. Bodily transformation and possession are hallmarks of Holmes's period as script editor. Thus, Ark in Space, ultimately written by Holmes when the original script became unworkable. Originally, it's a 6-part story by John Le Carrotti, who hadn't written for Doctor Who since 1965, and features aliens playing golf with giant heads. Le Carrotti lived on a boat for most of the year, so it was impossible to get a hold of him to go, "This script isn't working, what are we going to do?" So they paid him off, and Holmes just had to come in and write it. Holmes is always doing this, and in the end, he gets hit with his massive tax bill, because of course it's the mid-70s, so taxation is much higher. And that's why he writes The Sunmakers for season 15. It's a complaint about taxation. The Ark in Space, ultimately written by Holmes, sees an alien insect laying its eggs in a human in suspended animation. On emerging, the insect larvae consumes the body of the host while absorbing the memories and experiences of the host. We also see the transformation of another cast member going from an infected hand, which is bubble wrap painted green, but they kind of get away with it, to half insect, half human, to full insect. This sets the tone for the next 3 seasons, in which we get the following highlights: the slow motion machine gunning to death of a group of gas mask wearing soldiers, genetic experimentation, strangulation, doppelgangers, Egyptian mummies crushing a man to death, or he might be shot by his friend to kill him more quickly. A zombie Egyptologist killing his brother and his best friend, a brain slopping to the floor after it rolls out of a jar, men being turned into malignant alien plants with all stages of the transformation portrayed in horrific detail, petrol bombs, murderous robots with blood-stained hands, and the apparent drowning of the Doctor. And all of this between 6 and 6:30 on a Saturday evening, and then you could watch the Generation Game. The scene of the Doctor drowning particularly exercised Mary Whitehouse. This is the high point of Mary Whitehouse's complaints about Doctor Who. And the end of episode 3 of 1976's The Deadly Assassin seemed to force Whitehouse's hand. Whitehouse recounts a story of a 5-year-old telling his mother that he knew what to do with his younger brother when he, quote, makes me cross. I shall hold his head under the bathwater until he's still like the man did in Doctor Who. Mary Whitehouse, it's not top parenting tip of the week, I'll give you that. Mary Whitehouse notes of early Baker's Doctor Who. The programme contains some of the sickest and most horrific material ever seen on children's television. Doctor Who has turned into tea time brutality for tots. My personal reaction to the sight of the Doctor being viciously throttled underwater is unimportant. What's important is the effect such material, especially in a modern setting, upon the very young children still likely to be watching. Strangulation, by hand, by claw, by obscene vegetable matter, is the latest gimmick, sufficiently close up so that they get the point. Just for a little variety, show the children how to make a Molotov cocktail. So what are we to do? Sit back and say nothing at when, after panning to the contorted visage of the demented murderer, the final shot of this particular episode was a close-up shot of the Doctor, apparently his drowned-faced, lying still beneath the water. Nothing said, a new barrier broken. Whitehouse had clearly watched or received a very detailed and accurate report of The Seeds of Doom and The Deadly Assassin. And I think she has a point about both stories. I don't know if it's just since I had children, but I've got quite squeamish around some elements of Doctor Who, particularly Seeds of Doom, which I recently texted into a podcast to say they should just get rid of it because they do a whole keep or bin. So Seeds of Doom is written by the experienced television writer Robert Banks Stewart, who'd written Terror of the Zygons. What was meant to be in season 12 was actually in season 13. He never writes for Doctor Who again. I think he's the creator of Bergerac, but he's got this long career in TV. We see the body horror in close-up shots of scientists partly transformed into plants, and it's all kind of writhing material all over him. And the Doctor says, "Well, to save yourself, you've got to chop off his arm." And this, "Can't you do it for us? You must learn to save yourselves." And it's like Baker at his most alien. You get Molotov cocktails being made. Tom Baker waves a gun around the place, and in one particular scene, he twists John Challice's neck in a dangerous fashion if it had been copied by a child. Yes, that is Boise from Only Fools and Horses playing a mercenary. He's really good in it, though. It's also fairly homophobic. If you know it, the principal villain is Harrison Chase, who longs to play all day in My Green Cathedral, and it's all very arch and camp. He played Camp Freddy in The Italian Job, but it makes me really uncomfortable to view it now. In 1976 is The Deadly Assassin, written by Holmes himself. We find the notorious third episode, which is as violent as Doctor Who gets at that point. The Doctor bleeds. He's in a dreamscape, so it's not real, but he's been hunted by the actual assassin. And it climaxes with the Doctor being held underwater. Because the production team was using freeze frames at this point, the final shot is Baker held underwater, but there's no bubbles, so it looks like he's drowning, and then giving a suggestion to this 5-year-old as to how to kill his brother. Baker himself was clearly concerned about this episode, and concerned enough that he tells us that he knocked on the door of a random house and asked the surprise family if he could watch the episode with them, just to see if it was too much. Whitehouse is clearly onto something, as she received an apology from the Director General of the BBC, Charles Curran, and the ending was altered for any subsequent broadcast, so I think the original is back on the DVD. This is also the point at which the BBC seemed to start listening to Whitehouse, after the reign of Hugh Carlton Green as Director General in the 1960s, when Mary Whitehouse was deemed persona non grata. A culture change at the BBC is apparent in 1976, with the apology to Mary Whitehouse about this episode of Doctor Who, but also of Alistair Milne, director of a television programme, banning Dennis Potter's grueling Brimstone and Treacle, which he describes as brilliantly made but nauseating. And of course, if you know Brimstone and Treacle, it's the story about the girl who's in a vegetative state who's raped back to health by a devil who's doing God's work. It's subsequently made for film with Sting in the devil role, which is where the song "Spread a Little Happiness as You Go By" comes from, which was my mother's favourite song for that year, but she had no idea of the context. The fact that they don't shows something shifts at the BBC at that point, and they have started listening to Mary Whitehouse, and we can see it within Doctor Who itself. Holmes himself stated in an interview with Jean Rook that parents would be terribly irresponsible to leave a 6-year-old to watch it, Doctor Who, alone. It's geared to an intelligent 14-year-old, and I wouldn't let any child under 10 see it. In part, however, this reads like Holmes criticising Jean Rook herself. Rook was the great doyenne of Fleet Street at that point in time, and she gets on her high horse about Doctor Who. So the interview is in 1977 in the Daily Express. It's just at that point where Holmes is leaving the role of script editor. It takes place in a warehouse in Acton, and Holmes is described as looking like a vampire in a raincoat. Holmes also tells us that his favourite authors are Poe and Stoker, and he doesn't really like the Sherlock Holmes stories. But what prompts the story, and it's there in the headline for it, because the headline for the story is, "Who do you think you are, scaring my innocent child?" The background to the interview with Rook was that her child, who's crucially under the age of 10, spent a Saturday morning and afternoon telling Rook that he didn't want to watch Doctor Who that evening. Rook, who it's clear was allowing the child to watch Doctor Who alone, then watched what's clearly an episode of Pyramids of Mars with deaths by strangulation, with burning hands, crushing and shooting, depending on which episode she's wandered into. Pyramids of Mars was largely rewritten by Robert Holmes. His name's not on the script, but Holmes is all over it. So when the interview happens, it's clearly meant to be this frenzy around whether Doctor Who's got too violent. The point is Jean Rook is exactly the type of irresponsible parent who's letting their child watch Doctor Who, and Holmes points out, I wouldn't let a 10-year-old, anyone under 10, watch it. Having written Pyramids of Mars, written Deadly Assassin, Holmes would also write the final script of season 14, and that would become the final script produced by Philip Hinchcliffe. Talons of Wen-Chiang is often held up at the pinnacle of Doctor Who, or at least 1970s Doctor Who. The Victorian setting plays to the strengths of the BBC's costume and set department. The acting and direction are uniformly excellent, and the script is a sustained exercise in Victoriana. Baker plays the Doctor as Sherlock Holmes. We have a giant rat in the sewers, so a reference to the giant rat of Sumatra. We have a pathologist with a housekeeper called Mrs. Hudson. We have a chase and a music hall, which evokes the Phantom of the Opera. This connection is confirmed by the fact that the main villain is a horrifically scarred maniac who lives in the cellars beneath the theatre. Unfortunately, the script also borrows heavily from Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu stories. As such, the text is Orientalist and clearly racist in its depiction of the Chinese. The yellowing up of the white actor playing the principal Chinese character only compounds the problems within the script, which evokes and directly references the killing spree of Jack the Ripper. As the script was written well before Haley Rubenhold's important book, The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper, Holmes naturally repeats the standard claims about the victims of the Ripper, that they are all sex workers. Thus, we find a prostitute, this is Doctor Who at 6:15 on a Saturday, don't forget, being hypnotised or mesmerised by Li Sen Chang, the Chinese magician played by the yellowed-up John Bennett. Fu Manchu as Jack the Ripper, preying on white women. It looks like the BBC recognised that the horror content had become excessive in Doctor Who at this point. Philip Hinchcliffe was reassigned to the police drama Target, the BBC's attempt to replicate the success of Thames TV's The Sweeney, while Target's producer Graham Williams was appointed to Doctor Who with instructions to tone down the violence, which Williams indeed does. Williams' other problem is that rampant inflation is eating into his budget, and because Hinchcliffe had gone over budget on and over time on Talons of Wen-Chiang, he gets a financial penalty. So the money's not there to play with, so they have to go out with different scripts anyway. Robert Holmes would leave midway through the following season, so Williams' first season, with two last horror stories, one of which lifts liberally from Nigel Neal's Quakermass and The Pit. Neal, of course, had similar objections to Doctor Who to those of Mary Whitehouse. He didn't like the fact it was aimed at children. It was designed to scare them. He also thought it was a bad idea for a television programme. The type of violence associated with this period of Doctor Who, that is Hinchcliffe and Holmes' run, would return during the mid-80s and would be used as an excuse for the attempts to cancel Doctor Who in 1985. And that 22nd season, they kind of out of their tree in terms of what they're showing there. There's a cannibal motif running through that season. We see, therefore, that Holmes and Hinchcliffe certainly employ horror in their 3 years in charge of the production of Doctor Who. Their influences tend to be cinematic, the Warner's horror sequences of the 1930s, some of Hammer's productions of the 1950s and 60s, rather than directly literary. Hinchcliffe he'd read English at Oxford or Cambridge. Terence Dicks before him had been at Cambridge. He'd read English under Leavis, so he certainly knows all these references. Holmes has a much more interesting career. He's the youngest commissioned officer in the British Army in the Second World War. Then he's in the police, then he's a journalist, and he comes to this through film backgrounds, I think. The Doctor Who production of the time tend to produce pastiches of adaptations of literary texts. Thus, we have Jekyll and Hyde in space, with an element of Forbidden Planet. Frankenstein's creature reimagined as a collection of alien body parts topped with a brain in a jar, and various Egypt-based horror texts. Fandom calls this Gothic, but what about the actual Gothic? If we're thinking in terms of the conventions of the Gothic novel, which we see in the novels of the 18th and early 19th centuries, notably by Radcliffe, Lewis and Maturin, then we can see genuine Gothicism in at least 2 of Tom Baker's Doctor Who stories, The Brain of Morbius and The Deadly Assassin. If we think about some of the conventions of the Gothic that are apparent in those early Gothic texts, some of which are discernible in the earlier theatrical work of Webster and Ford, we can clearly see those conventions in these 2 Doctor Who scripts produced for the 13th and 14th seasons. The appearance of these conventions are not, I would argue, accidental. Rather, they are a conscious use of a set of narrative devices and an engagement with, perhaps unconsciously, a Gothic aesthetic which owes something to a residual Protestant poetics. The link between early Gothic texts and English anti-Catholicism is contested, but I think is fairly clear, and you do find some academic work which highlights this. And the appearance of residual anti-popery or the use of anti-Catholic tropes is one way of positioning Doctor Who within an Anglophone Protestant fantasy writing tradition, which is partly Doctor Who's connection to C.S. Lewis, which I've argued before. Doctor Who can be placed in a historical construction which sees the Reformation leading to the Enlightenment and thus to empiricist thought. There is a repeated narrative across Doctor Who of the Doctor confronting rogue religious zealots who want to destroy with fire those who espouse heretical, usually scientific views. Any viewers in the room today may recall a Dalek Emperor with God delusions, purging the earth with fire and declaring Christopher Eccleston to be the heathen. If only it was heretic, it would have been perfect. Or long-term viewers or viewers catching up on the iPlayer will recognise the obvious religious/anti-Catholic tropes in Tom Baker's Gothic season, notably Deadly Assassin, which I will discuss now. The most sustained and obvious engagement, however, of Doctor Who with English anti-Catholic poetics occurs in the programme's difficult 3rd season, in which we find the Doctor and his companion in Paris just before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 1572. But the only Gothic element in that story, arguably, is the character of the Abbot of Amboise, played by William Hartnell, so he's the Doctor's double, but they don't actually meet, so they don't get into the whole switching characters roles at all. Amboise is a Catholic cleric who works with the ruling Catholic Party in attempts to assassinate the Protestant admiral of the colony. No, it's to Baker's Gothic season where we must turn for proper Gothic. If we think of some of the major conventions or devices of the Gothic novel, we find them here in these 2 stories. The ancestral curse, anti-Catholicism, body snatching, cemeteries, a claustrophobic environment, entrapment or imprisonment, the grotesque, a haunted castle or house, mist, a lot of mist in these 2 stories, necromancy, the appearance of a revenant, even the uncanny can be found directly or indirectly in these 2 scripts. So Brain of Morbius has the name Christopher Bland on the title page, but it's actually written by Terence Dicks. It's a straight out pastiche of Frankenstein. Dix's original idea is that the Victor Frankenstein character would be a robot, so it would have no regard for aesthetics. It would be entirely practical in terms of the creature that it's building, to house the brain of a Time Lord super criminal called Morbius who had survived. So there's your revenant character straight away. The production team decide we're not going to have a robot as that. We're going to the usual. It's going to be a mad scientist. So it's Philip Maddock in one of the great performances in Doctor Who. It's completely over the top. Given that the Igor character, Pondo, is played by Colin Fry, who'd been opera singer, this kind of Grand Guignol operatics of it, which includes Kondo being shot in the stomach and his shirt bursting with blood as he dies at the end of it. Again, for the tea time audience, that mode is entirely appropriate. When Terence Dix got back from holiday and realised that his logical robot building a practical monster or that could survive anything had been replaced by a bog standard scientist. He got the hump. He had row on the phone with Robert Holmes and said, "Take my name off the script." Holmes said, "What name should we put on there?" And Dix said, "Give it some bland pseudonym." Hence, Christopher Bland is the name of the author. This diffused the row between Dix and Holmes. So it's a Frankenstein text. We can take Frankenstein as a Gothic text, I think. Fiona, we're happy enough with that? Yeah. Obviously, it plays more into some of the film versions of it. So at the end, the Frankenstein creature is chased off a cliff by torch-wielding locals rather than tracking Victor across the ice in a supreme example of the terrible and the sublime. Lots of mist here, in part to disguise the fact that there's no exterior shots. So the exterior has to be filmed inside the studio and it looks terrible. So they fill it with mist. The haunted castle, however, or Solon's castle, is done really, really well. And there's a specific conversation about the type of architecture in that building, which makes you think of Gothic architecture and that type of discourse. Morbius, as I've already said, is this revenant figure. Where does he live? He lives in the cellar. So you keep your mad relative in the cellar. He gets out, of course, at the end, and the Doctor and Sarah are imprisoned in the cellar. So far, so Gothic. Where's the anti-Catholic elements, though? They are the Sisterhood of Khan. So the setup of this story, for those who don't know it, is the Doctor and Sarah are sent to the planet Khan to prevent the return of Morbius. The inhabitants of Khan are this Time Lord adjacent sisterhood who are all immortal because they've got the elixir of life in a tabernacle type device in the wall of their cave. But the elixir isn't flowing. So the Doctor has to find some way of solving this. They are reading it, the sisterhood, through religion. The Doctor's argument is, if I drop a firework in the chimney, it will clear the chimney. The response of the sisters is to burn him for blasphemy. So we can see these space nuns are exactly that. They're space nuns, and the Doctor is the empirical scientist who they want to destroy with fire. I really like Brain and Morbius, but you can see why Mary Whitehouse really gets up about it, because you do get the scene of the brain in the jar. The jar gets knocked over and the brain slops to the floor, which is why they didn't have to operate quickly and put the brain into a glass jar. The original plan, of course, is to chop off Tom Baker's head, put the brain into that, and to stick the head onto this monster, which is described as chop suey, because it's all different bits and there's a big claw, and you can see why Mary Whitehouse gets concerned about it. But clearly it's evoking these type of Gothic tropes, and Terence Dix knows. But you're nodding sagely there, Fiona. You don't believe any of this for for a moment. Yeah. And so having survived Levis, so he clearly Dix knows, Dix knows all of this. Deadly Assassin is another one we can turn to. Now, this is by Robert Holmes, and this has got a large number of references in it. So it's partly about the Kennedy assassination. It's kind of evoking those films that come after the Kennedy assassination or before, in the case of the Manchurian Candidate. It's also got a sly reference to Harold Wilson's resignation, because the president of the Time Lords on Presidential Resignation Day says, "Oh, some surprises in this list," which we're meant to think is Wilson's the lavender list with all the surprise appointments to the House of Lords in it. Deadly Assassin is interesting for a number of reasons. It has no companion. So the Doctor is recalled to Gallifrey. He doesn't realise at the time he's been recalled by the Master, because he thinks the Master is dead. So there's your reverend figure. The long suspected dead Master now wandering on Gallifrey in a cowl, so like a monk, but he's this kind of rotten walking corpse type figure. He fakes his own death, so they put him into this kind of pseudo cemetery, and then he comes back again, so a bit more reverence. There is mist everywhere in this. This is meant to be like the cradle of Time Lord civilization, but there's mist everywhere around the citadel. So here's the kind of haunted castle. There's no companions, so the fill-in companions are two late middle-aged old men. Because what we discover in this episode is there are no women on Gallifrey, because it's the Vatican, because this is where we get the anti-Catholic element. In Pertwee's run, and right at the end of Troughton, Terence Dix had constructed a vision of Gallifrey which essentially makes you think of Krypton. They wear those type of robes, they've got these psychic powers, and they're the kind of the overseers of the universe. Holmes isn't having any of that. So what he constructs is this rotten, decadent society which has got so lazy and indolent it's turned in on itself. It's all old men in robes, some of whom are called cardinals. I can't think what he might be referencing there. He also tells us, of course, that it's an Oxford college as well. So academia and the Vatican come into play here. So between the reverend, the cowled figure, the citadel, the violence that's in it, I think we can see fairly clearly that Holmes is intersecting with Gothicism. We've also got a very strange narrative device in this, in that it opens with a voiceover, which you don't find in Doctor Who at any point up to this point. I can't think afterwards, really. Tom Baker, the Doctor, is telling us the story. It's a recovered narrative, like we find there, same in Mackenzie's Man of Feeling, when the story is based on the document that's found stuffed into the gun bar. It's a tale being told to us. It's already happened. You don't tend to get that in Doctor Who. What you tend to get is the story happens as we're watching it. But this is a scroll being read to us. It's that kind of ancestral narrative that we find in Hound of the Baskervilles, which is where I'm going to next. So, yeah. Oh, absolutely, that's it. You see what? So your standard reading is you go from the superstition of the Catholic period through the Reformation through to the Enlightenment and empiricist thinking. So the Doctor is this type of figure at the end point of that. He's Protestant only insofar he's a product of the Enlightenment. So when he goes back to Gallifrey, he's back into essentially the Inquisition, because you also get the scene in Deadly Assassin where they torture the Doctor as part of an Inquisition, and the way it's shot, it's in this type of cell, and it's all kind of knives and lasers. So it's fulfilling that type of vision of the quote unquote Catholic characters torturing the discordant element or the heretical element. So that's the end of a particular type of storytelling we find in Doctor Who, this 14th season. You can see Holmes hits these two high points with this kind of pseudo-Gothic text and then his Sherlock Holmes story. And then you get into space opera, and where they're trying to ape Star Wars, and Graham Williams introduces notions of God and this kind of demonic figure in season 16. Baker, you can see, hangs on too long, and there's various points at which Baker is threatened to resign. So season 16, he says, "Well, I'm off," and Graham Williams is told, "You have to solve this. He has to stay on." When he then does the same thing at season 18, because they've had enough of him, they go, "Thanks for all the work, Tom. Sorry to see you go. Mind how you go, son." And then Baker's next big role is Sherlock Holmes. In, as I've already said, a Sunday afternoon drama, part of the classic Sunday serial produced by Barry Letts. It's a very, very odd thing. I don't think it's available on DVD. It's certainly not on YouTube. As with everything else I mentioned tonight, it's on Daily Motion, who clearly don't care about copyright. It's slavish in its reverence to the text. And what you get is a sense of lots of actors who are very good in other things, who are quite good here at pretending they're playing Sherlock Holmes. I think the other problem, of course, is because they don't get a series out of it, it's deemed to be a one-off. And then 2 years later, Jeremy Brett will appear as Sherlock Holmes in Granada, to my mind, definitive version of it. That does for any further versions of this text with Baker in that role. Baker himself doesn't rate his performance in it whatsoever. You can see why they cast him. He's tall, he's got the staring eyes, he's played a space weirdo for 7 years. He might as well play the weirdo in Baker Street. What's interesting, of course, is that they go for Hound of the Baskervilles. It's the obvious one to go for. I don't think Hound of the Baskervilles is ever really adapted particularly well for television. I think Brett's version is quite good. I think the Stephen Moffat version is absolutely terrible, along with a lot of Stephen Moffat Sherlock. But it's interesting that of all of Conan Doyle's stories, it's the one we can most clearly see Gothic elements. In 91, I think Christopher Frayling had this great documentary series called The Birth of Nightmares, which is on the BBC, which is on YouTube. And he looks at Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, and Hound of the Baskervilles. So he clearly positions it as part of this 19th century outpouring of horror texts. And you can see some of those elements in that text. Ultimately, of course, there's a rational explanation. But Holmes does say, when he's looking at the map of Dartmoor, it's lonely, desolate, mist-filled place with these various isolated houses where strange things can happen. And of course, Doyle has already told us, he's described the smiling, sinister countryside. The countryside is far more dangerous in Doyle's world than the the town. Holmes says of Dartmoor, it would be a fitting place if the devil did decide to take a hand in the affairs of man. So this suggestion of the supernatural is there foregrounded. Ultimately, of course, there's a rational explanation. It's a big dog that's been painted with phosphorus. It's irrational, but it's rational. But before all that, we see a clear evocation of some of these devices. So we've got an ancestral curse on the Baskervilles. We've got that 17th century manuscript, or is it 18th century, that Holmes is so pleased with himself that he's able to date it almost precisely, which details this ancestral curse upon these figures. You've got the idea of cellars and the asylum with the escape of Selsdon, the maniac who's loose on Dartmoor. You've got kind of suggestion of doublings there as well. That the Hound thinks Selsdon is Sir Henry Baskerville because he's wearing some old clothes of Sir Henry Baskerville that have been given to him by his family members. And so the Hound has got the scent, which goes back to the bit about the shoe in the hotel early on in the text. You've got kind of a sense of the return of a figure believed to be dead. I'm going to spoiler it all for you now, but kind of Doyle gives up on the mystery element fairly early on in it. The person who's running the whole plot to kill the Baskervilles is himself a Baskerville. Roger Baskerville, the black sheep of the family who'd gone off to South America and was believed to have died childless, has in fact had a child. The child has come back to claim his inheritance. This is Jack Stapleton, who's passing his wife off as his sister in a not at all weird pseudo-incest way. Crucially, he chains her up in the house at the end. So there you've got the imprisoned female figure. And of course, the whole question turns around who's she going to go off with. So although it's not pure Gothic, you can see Holmes making use of, Doyle rather, making use of a mode of genre types that are there across the 19th century. And here we have Baker again. There's something about Baker that just screams Gothicism to people. Even in The Silver Chair, which, as I said at the start, is really starts a run of TV work for Baker, which sees him no longer necessarily solely associated with Doctor Who. That it's hard to make that Gothic, but certainly there's a kind of bleakness to that text, which is indicative of where the Chronicles of Narnia are going at that point. So if you recall The Silver Chair, I mean, it's the fourth book in the sequence, but if you go with C.S. Lewis's weird reordering of the Chronicles of Narnia, where you have to read the prequel first, even though it works better later on, it becomes the sixth text. And so it's really pointing towards the end of Narnia, the apocalypse that happens in the last battle. But even here in the Silver Chair, the darkness is starting to gather. So Eustace and Jill are the two children who now travel to Narnia. They travel there after running away from some bullets. It's an important reminder that entry to Narnia is often associated with trauma. Think about in The Magician's Nephew, it's to do with Diggory's mother dying. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children are evacuees, and here it's an escape from bullets. It also introduces the motif of the dead or dying mother. So if you recall The Silver Chair, it's a quest to find Prince Rilian, who's disappeared, on a hunt for the creature that kills his mother. When they find him, he's imprisoned in the underland. So we are still back in this kind of subterranean environment. He's chained to a chair. He's that prison figure. When they free him, they discover that the Lady of the Green Girdle, who's meant to be this good, beneficent figure, is actually a witch. So you've got that kind of doubling effect. And that suspicion around a particular type of female temptress that we find across Lewis. She transforms into a serpent. You have the fight between Rilian and the serpent, and he emerges triumphant. It's clear at this point that Lewis is once again intersecting with or rewriting Spenser's The Fairy Queen. You know, as Bill Gray made clear in his study of Lewis, Lewis is rewriting for a younger audience, Fairy Queen. As such, we can see that it's much closer to that type of Protestant poetics, Protestant fantasy, where we can put Spenser and Lewis. But we do have these kind of elements there, the echoes of the Gothic, the underworld, the prisoner, the dead mother, and the doubling of the mothers with the sinister women is quite significant as well. Of course, lurking behind that, of course, is Lewis's own dead mother. Lewis's mother dies when he's a child, and that seems to have a fundamental impact on him in the way that the death of a parent always has an impact. And there, in this TV adaptation of it, we have Baker himself playing Puddleglum, and a bleak figure who's ultimately heroic, but whose cynicism and downbeatness is directing us towards the end of this sequence, which will have all the children dying. But that's a good thing in Lewis's world. And then Susan, the sophistica who no longer believes in this thing, she won't get to heaven. So it's a weird ending of that. And where I'm going to finish, because I'm conscious now, I'm quarter past, is on Baker's two works of fiction, where we can see him not necessarily working with the Gothic, but certainly working with the grotesque and with horror. So in 1999, Tom Baker published The Boy Who Kicked Pigs, which has the subtitle A Grotesque Masterpiece. Either Baker himself or his publisher. This is when I met Tom Baker. So I always get into these stupid war stories about when I was a bookseller. So this is the short one here. So Baker was doing a publicity tour with The Boy Who Kicked Pigs, and I got very, very excited that he was coming to the branch of Books, etc., where I worked at Gatwick Airport. We had two branches there at that point, and the small one where he was going to do the signing was at the far end. No good for Baker. He really had the right hump this day because it was too far away. And he wasn't getting the crowd he was expecting. So I ended up talking to him. I got a book signed, and I said, this particular line, it seems to echo Henry Newbolt's poem, Vita Lampata. He went, well, you know, you get lots of different references and all this. Just kind of dushed it aside. But it's probably deliberate because Baker is a deeply literate figure. As having come from working class Catholic Jewish background in Liverpool, he's an autodidact. He had been a trainee monk, of course, so he'd been exposed to a Latinate culture. But one of his important TV jobs that he does get in the 1980s is the Book Tower, which is essentially a book review program. That's by the by. So he wasn't happy with the crowd. So we had to go and get a tannoy announcement put out. So Gatwick Airport put out, TVs, Doctor Who is signing his new book in the village. They didn't say which Doctor Who it was, of course, but lots of middle-aged men took a punt that it was indeed Tom Baker. So they rocked up to buy copies of the book, get stuff signed. Because it was nearly Christmas, there was a local school singing carols down by the Christmas tree, and it was their lunch break. So they were wandering around. I heard this child, and it sticks with me today. She had a sandwich wrapper, and she said, I got him to sign this, touching the sandwich wrapper. I don't know who he was, but everyone else was getting it signed. Because, of course, this is before Little Britain, before he'd really returned. Because, of course, Baker starts to really come back into prominence then, after the run of TV shows, when people who'd watched Doctor Who as children are in positions to make their own programs. That's why he turns up in that weird remake of Randall and Hopkirk Deceased with Vic and Bob, and also, crucially, why he's in Little Britain. So we then subsequently heard that Baker had wanted to take all the books down to McDonald's to sign them in there because there'd be definitely a crowd. And he was told that's not a good idea, but maybe you could come back another day and we'll do that. And that's. So I was doing nights the night before he was due in. The phone went and I answered, hello, it's Tom Baker. And I thought it must be because no one's doing impressions of Tom Baker because this was all John Cultural. Hello, yes, I'm meant to be up there tomorrow to sign, but it's very icy and I don't want to end up like Desmond. Because, of course, this was just after Desmond Llewellyn, Q from the James Bond series, had died in a car crash on the A27. And because Tom Baker lives down north of Rye, he was going to have to drive along in the ice and snow. He wasn't going to do it. So that's fine. We'll cancel it. So our manager contacted Faber and went, well, maybe you could come and do a signing when the paperback's released. There are no plans for a paperback release. And it never was released in paperback. It's a very, very strange book. I don't know who it's aimed at. It's probably a bit too early as well. If it had come out a couple of years later, I think it would have sold very well to the market who bought a series of unfortunate events, the Lemony Snicket, Southern Gothic text, if you know them. Very good adaptation of on Netflix. My daughter binge watched it over the summer. Now she's reading the books and like clear intertextuality. The characters are called Poe and the type of house they live in is really evoking that kind of Southern Gothic. Boy Who Kicked Pigs is weird. It tells us straight away this is the boy that Robert Caligari, who's 13, dies. And so he's this horrible child, and it goes on and on, all these terrible things he does. He causes this terrible car crash, and then he falls down into a tree, and he gets caught on thorns, and rats come and eat him. That's the end of the story. So the grotesque is here with Baker. Clearly making use of that. The illustrations are playing into that. They're these kind of pen and ink sketches, all kind of angles and weirdness. They don't look natural, but they stand in for naturalism. So there's Baker as author intersecting with children's literature, fable, fairy tales almost certainly, but definitely this notion of the grotesque. And then we get to Scratchman. which is a novel published in 2019. Now, Scratchman, so Doctor Who and Scratchman, Doctor Who meets Scratchman, there are various versions of the title. It's originally planned to be a film written by Tom Baker and Ian Marter in the mid-70s. Ian Marter, some of you will know, played Harry Sullivan in Doctor Who in season 12. Originally, the Fourth Doctor was going to be cast as an older actor. And so they were going to throw back to the kind of William Hartnell type figure. And so they felt they needed a younger actor to do lots of running around. Then they cast the 40-year-old Baker, and therefore Harry Sullivan became kind of superfluous to requirements. He becomes kind of a comedic figure, which is a great shame. He's a really nice character, and Ian Martha's very good in it. So he leaves very early. He leaves in the first story of season 13. He comes back in a cameo later on. Martha would go on to write some of the Target novelizations, which is how a lot of us came to know Doctor Who in the days before videos. Notoriously, he's the only person who writes the Target books who swears. So you get a strange moment where "bastard" said some character, and you go, "Wow, I didn't see that coming." He's also got an incredible strain of violence in his adaptation of The Invasion, where a soldier working undercover gets shot, but Martha has to go close, and the gun goes against his head, and his brain splatter over a tray of eggs. Anyway, so Martha and Baker were working on this script, and it was meant to be, those of you in the room with a taste of folklore know, Scratchman is an old English name for the devil. So it was going to be the Doctor who was going to take on the devil. It was going to have scarecrows, and there was going to be a giant pinball, and they were going to fight over that. And Vincent Price was definitely going to play the devil in this, but there was no money. So Baker notoriously on a Saturday morning TV spoke about this film and said, "Yeah, we're looking for funding." At which point, children started sending money in. Then the plan collapsed, and Baker had to send the money back to all these children. So this script is kicking around, haunting Tom Baker like a revenant. And then in 2019, he published it. I'm not sure how much of it Baker writes. If you go into the title page, James Ghost's name is there. So I suspect Ghost has a lot to do with it. This is Baker writes folk horror. It's set on an island. The scarecrows, the creatures of the devil, are transforming the islanders into other scarecrows. It's fairly graphic stuff. So there's a kind of fertilizer, which is ground up humans, which they feed to the people to turn them into scarecrows. And you get these kind of really striking images of they think a policeman's coming down the road, and it's a scarecrow with a burning head on in his hands instead of a lamp. And you get all kinds of weird stuff in the TARDIS. My daughter said to me when she heard about scarecrows, "What, like that thing we saw on the telly that night?" What's that? "Oh, you mean Words of Gummidge on Talking Pictures TV?" Because, of course, Words of Gummidge is a clear work of folk horror. That's the strangest children's program you're likely to see, and much, much closer to folk horror, which we get here. Then, of course, when Scratchman turns up and starts saying, "You can call me Scratch," you're thinking, "I'm not so sure about this now, Tom." Then the pinball turns up. And what you discover is that Baker and Ghost either have been watching Ghostbusters, or by a strange coincidence, they have the same central idea as Ghostbusters, because stuff starts appearing that comes out of Harry Sullivan's imagination, just like at the end of Ghostbusters. There are some interesting concepts in it. There's time nuns, again, is quite interesting. Maybe the throwback to Rainer Morbius. But again, it's the grotesque, it's folk horror, it's things other than the Gothic. But again, it's Baker working with this horror mode, because Baker seems to be haunted by horror, just as Doctor Who continues to be haunted by Tom Baker. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. Any questions, or do we want to go home? Fiona, it's all wrong, Paul. There's no Gothic in it whatsoever. Hmm. It's interesting. At the time, DWAS, the self-appointed experts, all hated it. It came bottom in their poll for the year because it challenges Time Lord lore too much for them. They don't get all the Gothic references, the fact it's about JFK. Now it's gone up in estimation. Yeah.
When a little bit later that he returns with Louise Jameson.
Yeah, Invasion of Time. They wrote that in 2 days, of course. Yeah.
My question was really about thinking about Catholicism, because of course, like we find out, don't we, that they've got a sort of non-interference pact.
Yes.
You know, that they're not, which of course the Doctor, contravenes. But but I was sort of thinking about that thing about faith not works.
Yeah.
That so there are sort of mixed signals about Catholicism.
Yes.
Protestantism. So you know, or is it like that it's a that the Gallifrey that we find is in that episode is like a kind of backsliding then from a more Protestant position, or from a, or how would you?
I don't know. I mean, I hadn't thought of that. That's a really interesting point. That the whole point of the time is not to intervene, because we discover in Underworld, which has a horrible reputation because they have to use CSO because the money's gone. They use all the money to make a spaceship set, and because they can't go and film in Wookiee Hole, they do the caves in the studio. The counter argument is that Doctor Who's exactly the type of program that we should be using cutting edge technology to try and get something on air. So what you discover there, particularly in the novel, because Terrance Dicks has so many of the novels, he's like formative influence on a lot of people's prose. Or is the person they read most, or that might just be me. That they've intervened in this planet to help their development, and then the minions destroy themselves, and so that's when they decide they're not going to intervene. Whereas the non-intervention policy, it's there in Troughton, isn't it? When Troughton's arrested, he says he ran away because he was bored, and that they've got a strict non-intervention policy. They never use their great powers. That's the point, which might be a comment on Romanism. They've got all that money and they don't do anything with it. But it's very mixed. But then, of course, we're trying to impose a single chronology on something that's got multiple. That's, of course, why. I mean, Deadly Assassin is interesting because it introduces the character, the idea of Rassilon. But it's because they've forgotten the backstory they give in Three Doctors when it's Omega. And it's quite clear at that point they're the same character. It's only later on when fandom goes, oh, actually, no, it was two different people and they were really great mates and there was someone else there that might be the Doctor. Because Terrance Dicks' argument is you only need 2 years worth of chronology. Then you can start the story again, because 2 years is the average lifespan of a companion in Doctor Who. When the new companion comes in, you can reintroduce the monsters people like and give them this basic chronology, and the audience will remember it. Video changes all that, of course. Once you can record it and you get obsessive fans, then you have an idea of you need a chronology there. But I think that's a really interesting argument. I have to think about that because that's going to mess up my chapter now. Because it is about good works. It is about good works. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. 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 Oh no, I think no, that's right. Because you know, all the makeup is there. The makeup's really badly done in Deadly Assassin but it's presumably deliberate. It's like they're going out to this high mass, whatever we're meant to say. Yeah, there's a dais there. Yeah. So yeah, it's mixing. Different colours of yeah, the gloves, the coronet there, it's a papal tiara. Yeah. I'll write that down. Like at a proper conference. I hadn't thought of that. No, thanks, Shani. I'll have to think some more about that because certainly the Doctor is doing good works. The Time Lords don't intervene. Yeah. No, it doesn't. It's no good. Oh well, that's that book gone. We have to go to the second one then. Any other questions? Canine Company, yes, there is that. It's interesting. I was trying to think of folklore in Doctor Who. It's all yes, and yes, and they're going to sacrifice Sarah's aunt's ward is going to be sacrificed. The series, if they got it, would have been amazing because it would have just been going around hunting down witches. It's in.
You know, the land that time forgot.
Yes, Louise Jameson.
And
Yeah.
then you've got K9 who's got sort of fun as well. So is he really so central to it? This film?
Who? Tom Baker.
But yes, in terms of that era, were they not? And his relationship with her is, you know, because of that.
Well, Canine Company isn't Leela though. Canine Company is Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane isn't sexualized at all. She's meant to be like the big sister. Whereas Louise Jameson, yes. And of course, Louise Jameson meant to be blacked up as well originally. She meant to have a clear tan there. Yes. But then they decide this is a bad idea. They do.
There's photos somewhere where they have her.
There is.
Like,
She's.
Yeah.
Yeah, horror fan rock changed.
Yeah.
Her eye colour.
They have to write that in. But yeah, it's included in 25 Glorious Years. It's there in that. I bet it wouldn't turn up in another publication like that.
Yeah.
Because it does find it. But that there's two important points there, Hugh. You're right. That had that gone to series, and Graham McDonald, I think, who's headed BBC One at the time, he's on record as saying that Colonel Company looks better than Doctor Who. There's a clear sense in which the spin-off is now a better production as far as he's concerned than the parent show. It's Terence Dudley doing it, isn't it? Who's a kind of grandee at the BBC. It's Dudley who helps to wreck Survivors, or he drives Terry Nation out of Survivors, doesn't he? Because there's elements of folk horror in Survivors as well, of course. So we've got that kind of aesthetic there. But Louise Jameson is a tricky one. I mean, Tom Baker's bloody awful as Louise Jameson. Yeah.
He is that symbology in teaching her?
She's meant to be Eliza Doolittle for a couple of episodes. Yeah. But their relationship collapses. I mean, the stuff that's coming out now, especially with the DVD release of season 15, if it was modern TV, Tom Baker would be gone. Could do. Yeah. And he teaches her to move away from superstition because, of course, the Sever team are superstitious. What did she say? You should trust in science, isn't it? In the horror fan rather. By that point, she has made that move. So yeah, Protestant teacher. That's it. Yeah. Yes. Yes, we are absolutely, because horror fan rock, of course, is set in about 1910, and it all turns on the difference between oil and electric, and the fact that they've got the telegraph and it's wrecked, and it's the secretary. She believes in fortune telling, doesn't she? And that's the contrast that's set up. So that's thanks, Hugo. I hadn't thought. Yeah.
Straw dogs or anything. And so I suppose that's what like mainstream horror was then, children's horror. That's going to keep up a little bit, or else it would have to, famous five.
Yes.
So they had to like upgrade it a bit, because if the parents were seeing, ultra, something more groundbreaking horror film all the time in terms of volume content, then their children would be kind of expecting something a bit more than the 1950s.
It didn't bother me.
No, I never walked up.
I was going to ask, I don't know, it's not a question really, but just that moment of the 70s as sort of like repressive desublimation, just these kind of things that are really weird get made.
Yeah.
Like that have a lot of horror content, they're often quite sexist, misogynist. There's there's a lifting of repression, but it's not nice.
Yes.
It comes out, and you get that across kind of 70s media forms in fiction.
Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, which I was thinking of, which you mentioned, The Exorcist, is like pro-Catholic.
Yeah.
Horror,
Yeah.
You
Absolutely.
know who to turn to in the event of a
Yes.
horror film, which is the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Do not bother going to the Protestant. Big waste of time. Who are you going to call the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Which is a trope, kind of interesting. And I was thinking, because I reread Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
And in that, the whiskey priest is like valorized because he hates, like Vatican II, he hates all the social reforms. He believes in the reality of evil.
Yeah.
Well, it's an appeal to a traditional Catholic church, like in the Exorcist.
Yeah.
Don't want to reform that.
Yeah.
But of course, also in that film, which is very Stephen King, he dies because his belief is not strong enough.
Yes.
So you also have this sort of liberal critique of the church.
Yes.
King, where, and King doesn't like religious zealots. It's a bit like Doctor Who. So you have this sort of doubling of Catholic belief.
Yeah.
You should get a priest or you should get a believer to do something, but also anxiety that this will turn out to be a zealot, might ruin everything.
I think that's if you think about Cursor Fenrir and Nicholas Parson as the vicar. He doesn't believe enough.
Yeah.
And then Briggs in the book goes further because when he can't, so in Cursor Fenric, it's belief that keeps the hemovores or the vampires away. So the Doctor's belief in his companions keeps them away. The Soviet army captain's belief in the revolution keeps them away. But the C of E vicar doesn't have enough faith. But in the book, Briggs has the line, and the 2,000-year-old lie was shattered, and then the vampires get it. So Briggs goes hard into this kind of anti-religion. There's belief, but not in organised religion, which I think might be influenced by Salem's Lot, because he would have been old enough to see the TV program. Yeah.
Book, and
Yeah.
in the TV series, had that great thing with James Mason saying like back shaman.
Yeah.
You know, like the idea that the Catholic Church are just a bunch of shamans.
Yeah.
That's in folk horror. They are just a bunch of.
Well, John Borman famously was offered the exorcism and wouldn't take it because he said it was a group of men trying to repress pubescent girth. So it's interesting that, and then like Frykin is horror on that set. I mean, Ellen Bernstein has that injury for the rest of her life because he just won't wait for that shock to be ready, and then he pulls the harness. So there's a sense in which you have that kind of, he emerged in New Hollywood, but he's this kind of dictatorial figure with a text that, I mean, I think he's viewing it differently to Peter Blackie. Blackie, I think, is well into the idea that the priest will save us, whereas I'm not sure Frykin is thinking in those terms, although that's how it turns out in the film. And she goes, right, and you got all that as a surrounding background. I mean, those BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas, they don't appear from nowhere. Or Children of the Stones, you know, the children's TV program from 76, which is again folk horror about stone circles, and you can see that this is all in the atmosphere.
Start The Exorcist about the failure of science, because firstly they think she might have a medical problem. They do these horrible invasive tests. That's always kind of like a bit that makes me feel ill. Exorcist. So they're giving her all these medical tests.
Yeah.
So there is that certainly, definitely, you know, who are you going to call again?
Yeah.
Science is failed. That's good.
Yeah.
In turn, I'm not sure of the relevance for like the wider chapter, but in what way do you think that the Gothic represents some sort of important quality to Doctor Who as a series, rather than just looking at Tom Baker's tenure? And do you imagine that there's something missing in terms of like a repressive desublimation that occurs in the Gothic era of Tom Baker? Do you think that there's something missing from the rest of the series that could be paired up with the kind of Enlightenment, emancipation type figure of like science and everything, with the Doctor who is coherent throughout the whole series as that type of figure generally, that is not occurring elsewhere beyond Tom Baker's sort of Gothic?
Yeah, I was trying to think when I was putting this together, and it chopped and changed and became something else, and then kind of became incoherent towards the end. I can't think where else Gothicism is in Blakey Doctor Who. Maybe Ghostlight, I think, which is, you know, it's a haunted house story. It's something nasty in the cellar. It's something you think is dead comes back, and you've got the upper observatory is a combination of nursery and laboratory. It's the lower observatory is the spaceship, but of course the Doctor in that is playing games. Even I can't play this many games at once, he says, isn't it? And it's partly there to quote unquote fix Ace, because those three stories, Ghostlight, Curse of Fenric, and Survival, are the Ace trilogy, where Ace is terrible. Something she's repressed, of course, and she's burnt the house down in the future because of something that's been left behind. So they have to go back to find out what's there. So there's a sense in which she's still haunted by the house, and they go back to find what was haunting the house in the first place. I'm trying to think of any other examples. I suppose State of Decay, maybe, although I think it's really badly made State of Decay, but it is, they think the giant vampire is dead, but it's escaped into E-space. It lives in the cellar below the ground. You've got the Doctor and Leela and Romana are chained up. And that's clearly the Doctor as scientist, because he makes the old equipment work again in the Technocothica. So of course they go deliberately that type of word to describe this collection of what is otherwise junk, but they make it work again. So I think you can see Gothic elements of Gothic stories, and you see that type of figure running through there. In terms of that type of, no, I mean, late 80s Doctor Who, no, mid 80s Doctor Who, Eric Sayward is very butch and very macho, and it's kind of shit. But also it is kind of a throwback to when men were men. And so it's weird that you've got Peter Davison, who's got this reputation for not being particularly manly, and then you give him a gun and he's got to run around with all these marine types in season 21. The problem is they look at season 21 and go, that was really good, we should definitely do that again, instead of going, that was an interesting experiment, let's do something else. And so then you get Colin Baker, who's probably miscast, going around with cannibals in nappies, eating rats, the whole eating your dead relatives. That's it. Yeah, in night where they've lifted, because the text is haunted by Evelyn Waugh's love, because Eric Sable's gone on holiday and he's come back and I'm going to rewrite that, and then put in like sitcom characters in it, or sitcom actors in it. In the case of William Gaunt, it works. It's not Doctor Who. It's the strangest script of the 1980s. It's not. It's a great script, but it's not Doctor Who. Yeah.
So sort of more experimentation with like ideas of time slip or time.
Yeah.
Quite, I would say, sort of more technologically orientated into the mechanisms of what would time travel look
Yes.
like, and what would it change, which didn't really get in Bacon.
Only in that last season, I think that's so. If you the production diaries of William Hartnell's run are available, and it's a really interesting piece of work. And so they look at what the BBC are thinking in terms of sci-fi before Doctor Who. And so because they're trying to ride on the coattails of the space race, they do a survey. What are the British public like? And A for Andromeda comes out on the back of that. But the survey comes back. They like science thrillers. They don't really like science fiction. So I do wonder if that dip in ratings is once you start producing science fiction and Doctor Who, the audience don't actually like it, or not enough of the audience like it, and they're far more interested. You can take the concept but put it into something big and glossy, and then you get away with it. I also think Davison, because they like Davison, and it's midweek as well, of course, because that's when they move from Saturday to midweek. But I think they're more engaged stories because they're not directly sci-fi. They've got big ideas like where'd the Big Bang come from? But actually, yeah, Davison's most interesting one might be Kinder, which is about religion and colonization, about the interior. Really shit snake, giant papier-mâché snakes. Yeah, but of course it's the kindest way is it's meant to be a representation of false fears, therefore you have something really rubbish, but no one's believing that whatsoever. But no mist. So that's a long way of saying I'm not sure, Dan, but I think you can see elements of it there across a run of stories. But again, because you come back to, you've got multiple authors and you've got different script editors, and 80s Doctor Who doesn't really have a coherent idea about what he wants to do. Holmes and Hinchcliffe are quite clear. We're going to do these literary pastiches. We want to scare children. Graham Williams, I'm not allowed to scare children. I have to do something else. And Star Wars is really popular. Therefore, we must try and copy that. Let's get a robot into it, a cute robot, and let's do God. John Nathan Turner finally gets the gig and just goes, what do we want to do? I'm not sure. Christopher H. Whitney goes, let's do hard sci-fi. Barry Letts comes on and goes, oh, that's good. It's gone a bit wrong. Barry Letts said, let's take it back to season 7. But the crucial thing is, let's get rid of Tom Baker, because he's become a joke. So what they don't want is, they don't want Tom Baker from season 17. So Baker has to go in. That's Peter Davison coming in. Peter Davison's not allowed to make a joke. They're terrified of jokes, but there's no sense. And then season 19, because you get 2 or 3 script editors, there's no sense of a coherent vision in a way that you can track across. Season 18 is all about entropy. It's a really sophisticated argument that every episode is about, every story is about entropy. Season 13 and 14, you can see what their sources are in terms of film and TV, whereas 19 is all over the place. 20's a bit better, but I don't say was not a great script editor, and therefore he's not bringing that level of intellectualism or wider cultural engagement to bear on the scripts, and that's why you get weird things. I mean, the most interesting script writers who turn up are Christopher Bailey with the 2 Mara stories. He was a lecturer in Brighton. He was writing that, and Philip Martin, who'd done Gangsters. And of course, Gangsters ends famously and goes very postmodern, where it's all essentially what Dennis Poppert does with Singing Detective in '86. At the end of Gangsters, they all walk off the screen because they become the characters. They become the actors again. And then so he says that Doctor Who's the only place you can get non-realistic drama on the air. So he does Benson Barros and Mind Warp. But it's only really when Andrew Cartmel takes over as script editor, that's when you get like kind of coherence across the run. Because what he's looking at is things like 2000 AD. And he wants that type of aesthetic there. And he brings in new writers as well, who crucially had watched the show as children. And therefore they have an idea of what Doctor Who was like. It's partly just based on nostalgia and early Baker as well. So that's where you get that type of run. And that's where you get the idea of Ace being haunted by her past and the Doctor as this type of psychotherapist type figure trying to fix it. But also you go back to the haunted house. Yeah. Any other questions, or shall we escape? It's 7:15. People are tired. The air's running out of the room. Anyone want to finish the wine or the crisps? They're very welcome to. Otherwise, we'll kill it now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul.